Thank you all very much for joining this morning. My name is Conrad Hall. I am the chair of the CIPFA Code Board. So thank you for coming along this morning for the opportunity to hear about the invitation to comment on the 25-26 code and give us your views on it. One piece of housekeeping: I don't need to bother with all the usual rules about mobile phones or whatever, because we're doing it online. But the session is, of course, being recorded, so you consent to that by staying on the session. We'll aim to divide the session sort of roughly equally. There's quite a lot of material that we want to get through, but I will ensure that we leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end, because this is an important moment. I mean, I do think the code is important each and every year, but I don't need to go into any detail at all about the issues we're all well aware of in local authority accounting and auditing, and all the issues that there have been around that. And so, perhaps particularly at this moment in time, development of the code and how we use that opportunity to try and reset the system is incredibly important. I'm joined as ever by a team from CIPFA, principally, as you see on the slide there, David Lyford-Tilley, Head of Technical and Standards, and Ian Murray, the Director of Public Financial Management, who will each take a session shortly. If we just move on to the next slide, and I'll run through the agenda and then hand over. I think I've probably done everything I needed to do by way of introduction. So we will be covering the Treasury thematic review of assets and accounting for them, which is incredibly important, and I think hopefully starts to find us a way through some of the issues that I know have been of concern to participants in that whole field. And then pick up through that changes proposed and actual to standards and legislation. We will talk through the strategic plan for the code board, and also the work of the Better Reporting Group, and hopefully how all that fits together as part, as I've described it, of the planned reset of all of the accounting and auditing and standards and everything in that space that, as I say, I know has plagued us all for some time. And I will, as chair, make sure we get plenty of time for questions at the end, which we'll do via the Q&A function in the webinar. I think I can pause there and hand over to our first speaker, please, David.
Thanks very much, Conrad, and thanks everybody for joining us. We are, of course, talking about these upcoming proposed changes, and I want to really emphasise that this is a consultation. So if you've got opinions, if you have thoughts about things we should be doing differently, or about anything that we're talking about in the webinar, we do want to hear from you, either through questions or, of course, through formal responses. I should also be making, we are aware that the usual timetable for the code consultation is usually in the sort of summer each year, but whereas this year everything is, of course, a bit later because we had a previous consultation on short-term code measures and delays, so that then was delayed and eventually put off by the election process and the incoming of new government. So our aim is that we're going to have this code published around June of 2025, and that we will then get back to the usual timetable for the following year's code. So just if you're thinking that this isn't the normal time of year for us to be having these discussions, that's certainly true. Conrad mentioned the wider context of the issues that we are, of course, seeing in the space. We're very conscious of those. And so we're looking at really some longer term reforms and changes here to support both CIPFA strategic plan, but also to make sure that we're building momentum and making sure that the backstop process and the kind of exit from that is as smooth as possible by trying to look at the sort of root causes of the backlog that's plagued the particularly English local audit space, but also just making some changes that we have actually been discussing for some time and that we think will improve things. And that starts really by talking about implementing changes from the Treasury thematic review. which is really the primary proposal for this year's code. Those changes are designed to enable a sort of more proportionate approach to the accounting for non-investment assets. The idea is primarily to space out formal valuations and use indexation in between, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about how that works in a moment. And we expect that this would result in, considerable time savings for valuers and preparers, and also for auditors, without sacrificing too much of the quality financial reporting that I think people still expect ultimately from those accounts. I also just want to note you may well be aware that there is a government local audit strategy consultation that was opened just before Christmas, alongside a raft of other local audit announcements. We are going to sort of mention that for context, but it's not going to be something we're going to spend a significant amount of time on in this webinar, because really the point here is to focus on the code consultation and things related to that. But that is just noting that, as putting a pin that as another element that's important. But that is also, of course, looking at slightly longer term measures about changes to the space and the potential creation of a local audit office. But it's not going to be the focus for what we're going to be talking about over the course of this hour. So the thematic review. It's worth noting several thematic reviews, of course, have been and gone in the past. They are often more focused on central government and haven't necessarily had an impact on the code. This one was more about the whole of the UK public sector. So while it did think about central government and health, it did also think about concerns held by, as it was then, DLUC, about the relation of the issues of local authority accounting and audit. So this was very much on the agenda when this work was being done. It's all about measurement evaluation of non-investment assets and whether some changes could reduce the challenges that were facing preparers in relation to these valuations, and of course then the audit of them. So Treasury went through proposals on these consultations of these proposals in March and December of 2023, finally publishing in summer of last year. It's all really related to the kind of concept of measurement and valuation, and trying to really make improvements that would, as mentioned, reduce burden on preparers, simplify audit considerations, but not sacrifice the kind of quality of financial reporting. So we are looking to support CIPFA LASAC's agenda and strategic objectives here by, adopting these really quite quickly. There's parallel discussion going on with FRAB about adaptations to the FREM code that's for the rest of government, but we're looking to press ahead with this rather than wait, because we think it's important to be forward-looking with these changes. So the headline is that we are proposing moving to a model where revaluations are undertaken on a 5-yearly basis, either everything each 5 years or 1/5 of things on a rolling basis on a 5-year rolling basis, and that would be then supported by indexation in between formal valuations. And that's the headline idea. The existing valuation requirements does mean we think that authorities and auditors have to spend a lot of time carrying out valuations, evidencing that they don't need to do that if the carrying value doesn't differ materially, and that whole aspect creates a lot of time on figures that aren't necessarily adding the most to most useful information perhaps to the accounts. So we are looking at coming up with a new method here that would allow basically define that following this 5-yearly rolling basis would be a sufficient basis of valuation, and would give an adapted model as a result. So we think there could be potentially some savings, but certainly less time. We are particularly interested in asking about the specifics of this, and we are proposing that, of course, if we went ahead with these changes, we would also develop guidance and materials to support it. So we do want to hear, what types of things would be helpful to hear from us in terms of, for example, supplying of indexes or guide to how to pick indices and how to apply them. But that's the kind of the top line proposal. And there are some related proposals. We don't expect that there will be many cases at all where we think it'd be extremely rare that no index whatsoever is available, and the guidance is using the best available index. But there is a language in the proposed changes that if there is really no index available for some particular asset group of assets, that even in that situation, the code wouldn't require valuation more than once every 3 years. So that would still reduce the work even in that rare circumstance. There are also some changes around intangible assets, also following thematic review. So currently we have valuation under IS 38, which does allow things to be carried at revalued amounts only when there's a fair value by reference to active market. The code currently states that this is pretty unlikely to apply to single entity financial statements for a local authority. But we do follow that approach. But the thematic review recommendation is to simply withdraw the option to use the revaluation model and to have intangible assets at historical cost only, which our understanding is that that is the majority case already, but just that it's, again, simplification where simplification is possible, removing that alternative option and just sticking with the simpler one. On the subject of simplification, we also need to sort of talk about transitional arrangements for the implementation of these changes. So moving from the world we're in now to what we're proposing from 25/6 and going forward. So the transition period would be the full 5-year period over which this transition would be happening, so over which we would be shifting from the current mode to this 5-yearly either rolling or once per 5 years, and the sort of use of indices over that period. The proposal that we've put in is that the IAS 8 would not be needed you would not need to follow that, but because this, of course, would be a change of an accounting policy, although one kind of created in the code. So this would be, in other words, a prospective change only, would not need to restate prior year figures based on this basis or indexation or anything like that. There would, of course, have to be disclosures and clarity to explain the kind of difference between how things might appear in comparatives and prior year figures and compared to the new arrangements, but that's again designed to try and simplify this as much as possible without creating any additional work if that's not needed. Once again, this is a consultation though, so we are interested to hear if you agree with that approach to transition, if you think that's going to create any significant operational challenges, or if there's any other transitional challenges that you might see coming out of these proposals that you'd want us to have regard to when we were producing the final version of the code. So if there are any concerns that you have, that perhaps something that's particular or to your circumstances or your authority, please do let us know, because we want to try and make sure that we are smoothing things out and not creating work unnecessarily as we're putting these things up. There are some aspects of the thematic review that are not completely nailed down as of yet. So in particular, there is a discussion around the use of alternative sites for assets that are valued using depreciated replacement cost. We are not proposing making any changes to this area in the 2025-26 code, but we are still seeking views on the consultation to see, from this year onward and when we're thinking about future areas, whether something should be happening in this area. The latest CIPFA standards don't think that valuations based on alternative sites are providing the right sort of information, because they don't provide the value of the existing asset in existing use, and that they think that providing the service from another location would not generally be in public interest. So CIPFA only allows the use of identical replacements and modern equivalent assets, doesn't allow alternative sites. The thematic review did also explore whether or not the alternative site provisions should remain, and the discussion is ongoing. It hasn't been finalised in terms of how this is going to be implemented in the FRAM. So an element of that discussion is about whether the modern equivalent approach should be applied to the current site, or if and the requirement to consider alternative sites should be removed. So as mentioned, we're not at the moment proposing to actually make any changes here, but it is an active topic of conversation at CIPFA, and therefore we are looking in the consultation for your consideration and input if there's a particular, if this is something that you do use or if it's something that you never think of and don't use currently. Either way, it's helpful to get a bit more of a picture of what in practice, if this particular area is actually adding anything, or if it would be a danger if we were to remove this, if it would cause issues. So no proposed changes there, but open question if you do want to do it. So that's the most significant change that we have looked at in this consultation. That's the sort of the headline item. I'm going to pass over to Ian now to talk about some of the minor updates and amendments to this version, as well as considerations for future years as well. So Ian, over to you.
Thanks for that, David. Sorry, just before you come in, I ought to have said we're going to do the Q&A at the end of the whole session rather than after individual bits. So apologies for not saying that. Ian.
Thanks, Conrad. Thanks, David. Keen to leave some time at the end for Q&A, and I do notice that don't know that we've got any questions at the moment. So if you do have them, please start getting them into the Q&A box so that we can cover them off towards the end of the session. There are, the world of financial reporting standards, it never sits still, unfortunately. So there are a number of things coming at us on the horizon. These are the standards for those that are interested. I'm just going to quickly touch on the two that impact for 25-26, which is IFRS 17, which deals with insurance contracts, and then some amendments to IAS 21. So if we move on to look at IFRS 17. So this has been around for a while as a standard. But the implementation or mandatory implementation in the public sector has been deferred to the 25-26 year. That was mainly because there are a number of central government departments with some difficult insurance businesses, and they wanted to implement smooth implementation of the changes to the standard. And so what IFRS 17 does is it replaces IFRS 4. It's a standard very much written with insurance insurers in mind, and so we think that it will have limited impact on local authorities, but obviously there may be the odd local authority out there where this will need to be a consideration in terms of some of those arrangements. So it differs from IFRS 4 in that it's clearer about what an insurance contract is. And as I said, whilst it's designed for insurance companies, it is possible that it could have some impact in local authorities. We've sought feedback previously on the sort of activities or some of the things that might be caught by IFRS 17 in previous consultations. And we know that there are a number of things like pension guarantees, which are currently accounted for under IFRS 4, which may need to be accounted for under IFRS 17. But we actually think that most of those are probably financial guarantees, and it might be that IFRS 9 is a more appropriate basis for the accounting. We also know that a number of local authorities might have small dedicated insurance entities that have been set up, and those actually, because of the size, they're likely to not need to be accounted for under IFRS, and UK GAAP would apply. So we'd be looking at FRS 102 and FRS 103 rather than the code. So our working assumption, and it is a working assumption, and we're happy to be for this to be disproved, is that we think that this will have limited impact. But we're interested to hear about where those exceptions might be, and also interested, to understand what they are, and then how we can support those bodies in terms of thinking about actually, do they fall under IFRS 17, or will they fall under standards that are already out there? So again, if there are exceptions out there that we're not aware of, we're keen to hear from you so that we can start to think about what that might mean. The second one I wanted to just touch on. Sorry, Ben, if you move forward to probably move on to the slide after this. Was looking at some changes to IAS 21. and this was issued in 2023, and it comes into effect from the 1st of January this year. Again, we anticipate that this will have, we think this will have limited impact to local authorities, and we're not anticipating that it will require significant changes to the code. But it may well be that we signal the changes in some of the appendices to the code. And what the change to the standard effectively means is that there needs to be a consistent approach to assessing whether a currency is exchangeable into another currency. Basically, it will result in a number of additional disclosures. Again, our working assumption is we think it has very limited impact, but if that working assumption is wrong, or you think it might be applicable, then we're really keen to hear from bodies who might be impacted, because at the moment we see these as things which will have little impact on the code. If that's not the case, then obviously we need to we're going to need to change our approach. Moving on, then, just wanted to touch on some of the changes to the legislation. Hopefully people are aware of this. So I think three things just to cover quickly: changes to the accounts publication deadlines in England as a result of the backstop dates that have been, that David referred to earlier. Some changes that might be coming in around fair value gains and losses on pooled investments, and then just quickly touch on where we see infrastructure assets at the moment. So if we deal with the backstop or the changes to the publication dates first, here's a list. Obviously, this has been well publicised in various places. Hopefully most people are aware of that. Effectively, what this means is the deadline for draft unaudited accounts will move, and has moved. So it will now be the 30th of June rather than the end of May. The publication date for audited accounts is still the 30th of September, but there will be these backstop dates, which means that where the 30th of September hasn't been achieved, an opinion must be given and a set of accounts published by these backstop dates. So again, hopefully familiar. We've had various conversations with stakeholders about what these dates will mean in practice. And really, this is about setting out the framework and a timetable for trying to build back assurance off the back of the disclaimed opinions that we're seeing as we clear the backlog. I think the key thing, and we probably will. I think we have this in the guidance, but we'll probably be sending hopefully helpful reminders around. Is at the moment there's still a requirement for local authorities to publish their unaudited financial statements in time for local electors to exercise their rights. So whilst these backstop dates are in place, where that 30th of June date maybe isn't achieved, authorities are still going to have to work back to make sure that they're publishing unaudited accounts in time for that to happen. Moving on then to IFRS 9 and fair value gains and losses on pooled investments. So IFRS 9 is designed to make sure that where there are changes in risk, changes in the fair value of financial instruments, those are captured in a timely fashion. When IFRS 9 was implemented, it was agreed that there would be I suppose, a period where we would, a moratorium, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, that would allow authorities to look at what they had in terms of those pooled investments and think about disposing if that was what they felt was the right thing to do. The statutory override that did that is due to end at the end of March this year, meaning that for 25-26, if the override isn't extended, then IFRS 9 will apply through the code to those investments. I think at CIPFA we've been fairly clear that we think IFRS 9 should apply. Where there is a degree of risk, it's important that users understand what that means in practice. At the moment, there is it's just closed. So MHCLG, as part of the provisional finance settlement, I have been asking some questions about what the impact of that change might be for local authorities, but has set out that its working assumption is that will end at the end of March, this year. So that would be a change again that would impact for the 25-26 code. And then finally, infrastructure assets. So again, this is an area where we have had a temporary solution in place, which is due to expire at the end of March this year. I'm sure people are familiar with the guidance and the changes to the code. They've been in place now for a number of years. Again, our working assumption on this one, based on conversations we've had with government, that this is a statutory instrument which government will seek to extend. And they've certainly confirmed their intention to do that. There are some considerations. We know that's different for the governments in the devolved administrations, where the audit backlog either doesn't exist or isn't quite so severe. So this is one which we will need to come back to. But for the moment, I think our working assumption is that for England, certainly there will be a statutory instrument which continues. And we will need to work on a longer term solution in line with the timescales for the build back over that period. One of the considerations in play is whether those authorities who are able to push ahead or want to push ahead with this, that we make sure the code doesn't hold them back from doing that. Again, we know that this is a very difficult issue. I'm sure many of us remember the scars from thinking about or trying to implement highways network assets back in 2016. So as we work through this, what we're thinking about is not just the accounting, but how can we approach this in a proportionate and pragmatic way so that we can find solutions that end up with the best possible financial reporting, but not at the expense of huge amounts of time and effort spent on something which doesn't potentially add a huge it isn't potentially that important in terms of some of the numbers that are in the accounts. So a bit of watch this space around that, but our working assumption is the statutory override will continue at least for the time being. And I think I'm handing back to you, David.
Yes, you are. Oh, there we are. Just getting myself unmuted. I'm going to briefly talk about some of the strategic plan and the kind of larger picture of what we're working on in CIPFA LASAC and with the Better Reporting Group. But then after that, we are going to be getting to the questions. So as probably about halfway through our time here, some questions have started coming in. So thank you very much for sending those in. And if you just do have anything else that you want us to know, or if you want to have anything else that you want us to discuss in the back half, please do send them over. So let's talk a little bit about the CIPFA LASAC strategic plan. So CIPFA LASAC has been refining and updating its strategic plan with a focus to kind of improve the presentation of local authority financial statements, make sure that those accounts clearly present what the key messages are to the users of the accounts. And that was previously done against a sort of stable platform, but we have been updating that plan to advance that agenda in the context of what we're looking at for the longer term reforms and in the context of the local audit crisis in England and of course the government's aforementioned consultation on local audit strategy definitely plays into that. The key objective is still to get messages out to users and make sure they have the information they need to make the decisions that they need to make on the basis of that. But we are also having in mind to balancing that against the need to address resource challenges faced by preparers and also by local auditors as well. So these are some of the key projects. Better Reporting Group, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. The thematic review, which of course we've been talking about over a lot of this session. Also looking at longer term solutions for infrastructure assets, as Ian was just touching on. And we're also looking at the kind of structure and format of the code. So we have a longer term project to consider how the code is laid out, how the formatting looks, and really how the code works as a whole, as a document, and as a sort of a piece of an actual kind of part of what people use to do their work, because it's been sort of added to and edited, of course, over years of time. And we think it's time to maybe take a step back and try and look at how it's laid out, which sections are next to one another, how it's put. So if we could make it clearer and easier, and also just generally make sure that there's nothing in there that's sort of just been left over iterations and could be tidied up or better explained as well. So those are the key items. I'm going to talk briefly about the Better Reporting Group. So the Better Reporting Group did exist previously, but we relaunched it last year to be the kind of primary driver for generating innovative improvement ideas. We want the Better Reporting Group to be a place where, if there's something we think that would improve the quality of financial reporting in the sector, and the BRG is thinking about how we can do that and who is best placed to do it. And that doesn't just mean updates to the code either. It is been reconstituted as a subcommittee of CIPFA-LASAC, so the BRG can report directly to CIPFA-LASAC if they think there are code changes to be made, but also can work on projects that might be more about correct application of the code, providing resources, guidance, whatever else is needed really to do what's what. And if any of you were at our local authority accounting webinar conference that we had in October of last year, you will have heard us talking about the Better Reporting Group, which was at that time trying to make sure it was finding out what the most important areas of the and themes for the BRG to focus on were. We have now picked some of those. So these are some of the key themes and areas that BRG is considering and will be creating projects to work on. And the ones in orange are the ones that we're aiming to start over the course of this calendar year. But the idea is that the group should have the flexibility to explore new ideas, propose changes to standards and guidance. And to do that, we really need a BRG that's going to focus on collaborative effort from practitioners in the sector, along with other suitably qualified experts as well. So we are trying to cast as wide a net as we can in terms of the membership of the BRG, either the core BRG committee that will overlook everything that's happening, and or looking also beyond that, actually, at the specific working groups that are going to be carrying forward each of these projects. So BRG members will perhaps just join one particular working group on one or more of the themes that's on screen here, stay with the group for a while, work on it, and then perhaps move on after that. So it isn't necessarily going to be a permanent commitment, depending on what their interest is. That means that there are different types of BRG members: the core members that are looking over the most important decisions, recommendations, and the direction of the group, which is the core group. We currently have 9 members, and we are looking to bring in additional participants for particular projects and meetings. The core Better Reporting Group meets at least 5 times annually, and we have a meeting coming up shortly, and then there are also meetings planned for March, July, September, and November. And there is an expectation that members would also conduct research and project meetings alongside that. We do also have co-opted members that are being brought, as I mentioned, into one or more specific projects with guidance and leadership from the core members. And we are also pulling back feedback groups of key stakeholders to reflect on and feedback on project work as it progresses. If you'd like to be involved in any of those aspects, or if you have any other thoughts about the Better Reporting Group, then I've put up here our inbox, policy.technical@cipfa.org. So if you do have any thoughts, or if you're interested in contributing, or if you just want to find out more about what the Better Reporting Group is doing, please do get in touch, policy.technical@cipfa.org. Equally, if you have any thoughts or questions about anything we've discussed today, we are, of course, just about to start our Q&A session, but you're very welcome also to send in questions here at any time if you have any thoughts. So with that, we are officially at the questions part. So we are through all the potential updates and so on. And I think, Conrad, over to you to chair the Q&A session.
Super. Well, thank you very much for that, David and Ian. I thought that was really clear and helpful. And I can see that a number of questions have already started to be posted. A couple have been answered in the chat. If you ask that question and you're not sort of really content with the answer, maybe sort of re-ask the question, if you see what I mean. But I'll assume that those answers are satisfactory unless I hear otherwise. I'm going to structure this a bit because there's quite a number on fixed assets. So I'm going to try and deal with other issues first and just hopefully tick those off reasonably quickly, and then moved into some of those asset and infrastructure accounting ones. So there's one from it's from an anonymous participant around IFRS 9. I think that was sort of answered in the presentation. It's probably worth saying, emphasises my personal view rather than necessarily a formal view of the board or of CIPFA, but I don't think as a profession, we help ourselves by continuing to seek exemptions from accounting standards that apply to the rest of the UK public and private sector. I think we need to be championing the value of proper financial accounting, and when we say that we need exemptions that no one else seems to rely on, I'm not sure that really helps our reputation. So I kind of on a personal level agree with the approach that CLG are proposing there. Others I appreciate may have another view. And then Matthew Fernandez-Graham asks, could CIPFA focus on simplifying the code requirements as much as possible before we review the structure and format of the code? I mean, I suspect the two go sort of hand in glove a little bit. But David or Ian, or indeed other colleagues on the call, I don't know if you want to add anything to that point.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that simplification is definitely something that's on our agenda as well. And the structure format thing is as a slightly longer term project, and part of that is about achieving simplification as well, because I think having a code that can be difficult to read and follow and lay out, I think makes things more complex. But I do agree that they're very interrelated projects. We are considering simplifications as well, and I think we've had some good discussions about to what extent. Obviously, we're working on an IFRS basis, but with appropriate adaptations, and we have had some discussion, I think, already about what the appropriate amount of adaptation is, and whether we could do more to seek simplification, or particularly where there's areas where things that are designed for perhaps private sector things in IFRS, we could go for more.
Okay, and I've just been given a reminder to read out the questions more clearly, so apologies for that. So Alison says we can't see the questions, Conrad's response, so my response doesn't make sense as we listen in. Does that then also apply to the questions that have been answered in the Q&A? Can I just check with CIPFA technically? So let me read those out then to avoid the ambiguity on that, and apologies. Well, in fact, I'll read one out because I do just want to try and deal with the point about taking everything else first and then moving on to assets and infrastructure. So Julie asked, could you just repeat what was said about the local inspection of unaudited accounts, please? Is there a statutory period? For example, must it happen during the first 10 days of June, for example? And Hazel from CIPFA has replied, before an audit opinion can be issued on the backstop date, the inspection period must have been completed. Those councils that do not meet the extended draft accounts publication deadline of 30th of June need to bear in mind that they will need to publish at least 30 working days before the backstop date. And then bulletin 18 is what you want, Julie, and anyone else who's particularly concerned on that point. Bullet 18, 1.8, goes through this in more detail.
And it's worth noting that for example, for the next backstop date, that the time that to do that unfortunately has just passed. So because it's 30 working days, it can it comes up. There is a table in bulletin 18 that shows all the backstop dates and the sort of latest possible date that for publication of unaudited accounts in order to meet that date. So of course, still the goal should be the actual draft accounts publication deadline, but there's a calculation of the of those dates in that bulletin if you want to look for future ones.
And then we've also, on a similar point, again from an anonymous attendee, is there an expectation that public inspection commencement will move back to the 1st of June from 2028-29? David, could you just deal with that one, please, or someone else on the team?
Yeah, as far as we know, in the pre-existing dates for will reassert themselves once we get out of the end of the local audit timeline. I suspect in reality what will happen is that after there's been a couple of years of the backstop dates and so on, government will have to take a view of how those are progressing and where audit is at before deciding if they want to continue with current plans or end them. But that's as written, that's what we're expecting, that all standard dates will recommence. I can see Ian also wanted to come in on that one.
Ian, please.
Yeah, so I think that has to be the working assumption at the moment. But as we and I don't want to get into it here because it's not what we're here for this morning, but those who have had the opportunity to look at what's being proposed around a local audit office and some of the wider reforms to the system, government has a big piece of work that it's doing at the moment, and that might include looking at that, but that will include looking at the way that this currently works. So I think if people are looking that far ahead, great. But I would assume so. I think you work on that assumption, but I also think that's one of those things which is up for debate as part of the work that the government are consulting on at the moment.
Thank you. And I think I have one other question before we start moving on to assets and similar points. Other questions are coming in, so but I'll just do this one and then we'll move on to the asset side of things. So Matthew Fernandez Graham asks, is there consideration of amending the accumulated absences requirements, as this is onerous to calculate but rarely material? David or Ian?
It's not on the list of things at the moment. It's not something that we routinely hear as being a huge burden for preparers and auditors. One of the things that we will want to look at is pension fund accounting, and
Yep.
the accumulated absences is all part of IAS 19. But I suppose short answer is no, not at the moment, simply because it's not something we routinely hear as being a problem.
Clearly, if the response to the consultation suddenly comes in with a raft of colleagues saying that actually that is a significant issue, then that's a position that can be reviewed. Thank you for that, Ian. The question from Matthew then, and I am moving on now to assets and similar matters. Would CIPFA LASAC also look at valuation of surplus assets and potentially investment properties, given that most are retained for many years? It does prompt the question, doesn't it, of surplus assets and why they're retained for many years, Matthew. But Ian or David, would you like to have a go at that one, please?
So I think the short answer is that the thematic review has effectively looked at non-investment properties or non-investment assets. So surplus assets and investment assets weren't part of it. We would be happy to look at those again in the fullness of time. I think our working assumption is that if those are things which are held for commercial return, or where the benefit might be a commercial return rather than for their service potential, then the appropriate basis for them is fair value. And I think it goes back to some of the points around IFRS 9 and pooled assets. I think if local authorities are doing things because of the return that they may generate, or then there is risk and reward there, and it's appropriate that that gets reflected through the accounting. So at the moment, those things will still be on a fair value basis, and will need to be valued on an annual basis in line with the requirements of the code and the underlying standards.
Thank you for that. Moving on to another Matthew then, Matthew Weller. I'll read it out. The proposal for the changes to revaluations suggested that council dwellings would potentially need to be revalued every year. Although these are fairly quick for a valuer to calculate, it takes a lot of time to process these valuations by finance teams. If the aim of the change is to make time savings, then I suspect these will be limited if dwellings are excluded from the new requirements. Is there any potential for dwellings to also be amended to once every 5 years with indexation in between?
So at the moment, we're following this for operational PPE because that's where the Treasury thematic review has gathered evidence and what it's focused on so far. And so that's been the focus of our work. I suspect, though, if we find that this, depending on how implementation goes and feedback from it, assuming that we all progress forward, and particularly, I suppose, how this goes in other parts of government based on implementation elsewhere as well, it certainly would be an approach we could consider for other types of valuations as well. It just depends on case by case. Not all classes of assets are changing so slowly or infrequently that this is appropriate for every class of assets. So we would have to, I think, consider it.
Okay, let me ask two questions together now, both from an anonymous attendee around indexation. So the first, will the indices that are chosen probably differ by audit firm, And on a at least somewhat related note, as far as I'm aware, and based on comments from other local authorities, auditors are not keen on using indices for valuation. Has there been discussion with audit firms for buy-in? I think the answer to the last part of that is definitely a yes, but it's a complex issue. So Ian or David?
So I think there was another one which was talking about sort of the required, sort of, I suppose, unvalued assets. So can I deal with both of them
Please, yeah,
all in the round? So, so the rewriting of this is driven by changes to the FREM and effectively what the change we're proposing in the code will do. At the moment, there's a bit in IAS 16 which we mirror in the code, and I'm going to garble it, but basically says it talks about sufficient regularity. So we would say and sort of custom and practices that is 5 years. So sufficient regularity to make sure that they're fairly stated, or words to that effect. That requirement will go. So there will be so that there will be and will be replaced by, if you do one of these things, one of these three things, you will be complying with the financial reporting framework. So if you value on a 5-year basis, a rolling 5-year basis, and then use indices in the intervening periods, you will be complying with the financial reporting requirements, and therefore that thing about unvalued assets, or the assets that haven't been valued for because you're not due to value, you're in year 2 and you're not due to value them for another 3 years. That should go away, because auditors will be able to point to the financial reporting requirements, and so long as you're adhering to the financial reporting requirements, that should be sufficient for them. This is, as we said, this is for non-investment assets, so this is just for operational assets at the moment. But we've got to start somewhere. Indices should not be driven by auditors. Indices should be driven by preparers. So it's a preparer judgment what index is being used. And I think, as David said, we want to explore how we might be able to support that, either with guidance about how to choose an appropriate index, or possibly even looking at how we might be able to, how we might be able to specify indices. I can't see us doing that through the code. I think that oversteps what standards are there to do, being completely frank. So so that will be a judgment which you will need to make, but we want to understand, we want to provide some support for that. There will be discussion with auditors, and there should be discussion with auditors about indexation. However, I think once you've agreed on a set of indices for particular assets or particular classes of assets, that's not a conversation you should have to revisit in huge amounts of detail every single year. So there will be some one-off, conversations, and I think that's appropriate. We're talking about trying to make things more efficient. We're not talking about doing away with assurance as an important process altogether. So I think there will be conversations, and there should be conversations, but they shouldn't be happening every year. And actually, where you've got indexation, or you've used indexation, you will actually then be able to move the number. So you'll be, at the moment, you're not allowed to use index. You might be using indices to determine whether you've got a material movement in the value of your assets, but you can't use, or you shouldn't be using indexation to actually move the number. You should only really be doing that, when you're doing formal valuation. So I actually we think our working assumption again is that this should make some of those conversations between audited bodies and auditors a bit easier. But it's not going to do away with all the conversations. There needs to be conversations, but that's what auditors are there to do. And then I think there was something about, again, what would that mean for surplus assets and investments? Well, they're not caught by this, so they were. I think, as I said earlier, they will still be on a sort of on a fair value basis, because we think that's the most appropriate accounting for those assets, at least for the time being.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. Another question on indexation, Ian. I'm assuming it's to you anyway. How will the indexation valuation of PPE affect HRA properties, brackets item 8 charge, and annual revaluation, such as investment properties?
So I think the short answer is it won't, because those assets aren't caught by the changes that we're making to the code, or the proposed changes to the code.
Okay. And then moving on, so a question from Audrey Allen Chitwa. Audrey, nice to see you. A key delay in producing the accounts relates to the valuation of fair value level 3 pooled assets, where the auditors rely on audited financial statements to support valuations. Excuse me. Are there proposals in relation to the valuation of these assets to use indices in the statutory accounts?
There aren't, and whilst I'm happy to be corrected, I would struggle to see how they might be of use, where we're talking about level 3 investments. So I think the problem with level 3 investments is, or the challenge around level 3 investments is because you don't have you don't have the observable inputs. You've got to, there is more estimation uncertainty, and so there is work to do there. Again, happy to explore that in more detail if people have got whizzy ideas about how we could support preparers with that. But I suppose I'm struggling slightly to see how that might apply in practice.
David, did you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I was nodding to agree. I
Yeah.
think it's a difficult one. I don't think it doesn't seem like it's a close fit for the kind of the situation and the circumstances that lead to why these proposals have been made for operational PPE. It seems like a different kind of beast to me. That being said, I'm sure that if there are things that we could consider, other ideas that might make that simpler, then we would be very open to them.
And that of course is one of the points of sessions like this and of the consultation. Let me ask a couple of different sorts of questions now. So from Anonymous, would there be enough time for the external auditor and auditor bodies to review and agree the proposed changes with the 25-26 code? I'm mindful of how the external auditors were not receptive to the 2021 code proposed as a result of COVID-19. Well, that might be a fair comment about 2021. I mean, clearly the auditors don't agree changes to the code. CIPFA does that on the basis of feedback and to the consultation. But Ian or David, I mean, I think you've acknowledged the issue on timeliness. I mean, this is just part of the challenge in resetting the system. But is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so you're quite right that we have obviously had a different timeline for consultation. We still have actually had the same length of consultation window that we do in normal years, just at a different time of year. Although of course that means that window is closer to when that code would then come into effect. I should say that decision making at CIPFA does include representatives from auditors as well, and that we do engage with them through various stakeholder groups and committees as well. So this is something that we do talk to them about. And we do very commonly receive consultation responses from auditors when we do these consultation windows as well. And we are very conscious that obviously if the code produces something that is for some reason a challenge for auditors or isn't conducive to carrying out audits, that is definitely a consideration. That is something that we think about. So we are definitely trying to engage with auditors and make sure that we are balancing their needs, because ultimately speaking, a code that perhaps is convenient or sort of good for preparers and users, but which isn't auditable wouldn't necessarily help us here. So yeah, it is something that we're open to, and we do actively seek responses from that audience.
Okay, and then
Yeah, so what David said, I think this is signaling intent, right? So we kind of, if we were whatever normal was or is, we are not operating in normal times, are we? So and the backstop dates and that kind of that's just a clear example of that. So yes, we work on the basis that we have a code out in sufficient time for people to be able to take that into account at the beginning of the financial year, etc., etc. We think we'd love to be doing that. We sort of are where we are. We still think that we're signaling intent through things like this and through some of the wider comms, and that gives a chance for people to don't wait, start having some of these conversations now, because because and in fact, we're moving with some of the thematic review, we're moving at a quicker timetable than we have done traditionally. So historically, the changes would be made to the FREM for 25-26, and we wouldn't have brought them in through the local authority code until 26-27. So what we're trying to do is where we think there's benefit and where we think it can have some impact to help improve the situation that we're in, we're trying to bring these things in as quickly as we reasonably can. So yeah, this hopefully is helpful. Again, we're interested to see whether it is or not. But it doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that you have to wait for the code to be published before you can start thinking about these things, I suppose.
Indeed. Now, this next question might be tricky to answer, but if there is anything that can be said, is there sufficient market capacity and expertise to ensure that valuations can be undertaken in a timely manner for local authorities every five years? I think the answer is we've not seen any evidence to the contrary, but I mean, maybe if there's anything to
I mean, very briefly, the total amount of valuations that we are expecting to happen on an annual basis will be lower than it is now, and significantly lower in the most part because not necessarily all, but many assets, perhaps most, are currently valued on annual basis and for all of these things, and so we're expecting that this should reduce that. Obviously, there'll be a conversation to be had with valuers about it. So, for example, whether it makes sense to work for your asset base to follow the rolling basis, so 1/5 each year, or to do it on the 5-yearly, everything big bang every 5 years, would depend. I would say that it's a good conversation to have with your valuer, because if you're doing something on, for example, the big bang basis, you don't want your big bang year to be lined up with everyone else's big bang year, if at all possible. So there are some, questions about sort of application here, but the overall, we're expecting that this should lead to fewer valuations being done than are done presently.
Okay, 2 or 3 more questions I want to try and quickly get through and then close. So Matthew Fernandez-Graham, could CIPFA mandate the order in which the statement and notes are shown in the accounts to make them more in line with WGA and make it easier for auditors to follow? I have to say I'm not personally in favour of that. I think you need a kind of degree of local discretion about your own account.
Yeah, and like what's important in different places will differ. So
Yeah.
I don't know that I agree either. That being said, I should say that we are talking about one of the things we're talking about with government is the fact that currently we're preparing for a lot of different audiences and
Yeah.
a lot of different reports. So maybe not in this way, but we are talking about could we make the reporting more closely tied to what goes into other forms of reporting and try to reduce duplication.
Indeed. And then question, would this have an impact on whole of government accounts? Well, I hope so, yes, because the whole of government accounts were disclaimed because of the issues in the local authority sector. So I hope this is one step on the way to being that.
And as mentioned, they are looking at putting the thematic review in the rest as well. So this isn't going to be local government only. FRAB is looking at putting this in everywhere, so it's not like we're going to be an outlier.
Yep. And then one last, going back to the technical area again now. Initially, I thought that all assets would have to be revalued annually, i.e. formal and indexation, but your last answer said not. So just to confirm, the indexation is only to be used to assess material movement, David.
Yeah, so that's not the case. And the idea is that there would be a formal valuation, either every asset altogether once every 5 years, or a fifth of assets each year on a rolling basis. In between those valuations, you'd be using indexation to update the value of the asset, but not through a formal valuation process. So the values would change year to year, and then when it hits the formal valuation, you'd move to whatever that formal valuation was, and then continue applying the index in between. So 4 years of indexing value, 4 years of indexing value.
And I suppose if you'd done your indexation and the movement wasn't material, you might consider that you didn't need to. You might consider that you didn't need to make the adjustment.
Okay, we're at the end of our hour. We've got or had 100 people on the call. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your questions and comments. Thank you to Ian and David at CIPFA, but also the significant team behind them who've helped with all of this and all of the great work that goes into the code, and also to the technical team at CIPFA for helping to make sure that this webinar ran, I think, very, very smoothly from the technical point of view. I hope you found it helpful. Obviously, this is to discuss issues coming out of the code consultation. Please do send your formal responses in as well. We do really need and value those in order to make the final decisions on the code. Maybe, David, could we just perhaps put up the address for responses to that again, just as a final reminder? Brilliant. Super. Thank you all very much. Pleasure to see you all, and look forward to seeing you again shortly.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.